Hi, everyone. So from my introduction, it seems like I'm more a writer, but I wear another hat as well, which is of a performance maker. And I sort of live a dual life between the writer's desk and the studio and the stage. But today I'm going to talk about the stage and studio life. My early training is in dance, and I started out with Bharatnatyam, later studied contemporary dance theatre. But the works I'm interested in making are not bound by these disciplines. In fact, I find it sort of irrelevant to define performance by genre or field. All our curatorial practices are defined by that. And someone will say, "अरे ये तो theatre नहीं है, नहीं डाल सकते हमारे festival में." And I think that just limits how we look at performance, because what you're doing is you're not receiving what's in front of you. You're too caught up with the definition. So I'm not sure if I make dances. I'm not sure if I make some sort of vague performance, but my background is in dance and theatre. I'm also not sure what my process is, but lately I've been interested in, just as I'm intrigued by the idea of genre being porous. I'd like my process to be porous. That is to say, I don't want to repeat the same process for every work. To me, the process has to be defined by what you are working with at that particular time. So from one project to the next, I'm not going to do the same thing, because that means I'm not responding to the content or the work I'm dealing with. And that also means that I don't want to replicate the same conversation. Every idea requires a different conversation. So you will see that these are a couple of earlier works of mine, very rooted in dance, very formal, but not all of these were meant for a proscenium. Some were designed for very intimate spaces. Some were performed outdoors and indoors with audiences on two sides. But from very dance-based work, this played just last week, a couple of days ago. I was a co-creator on this work, which I made with Sujay Saple. Again, very formally rooted by form. I mean, I'm not trying to tell stories. I'm interested in association. So rather than a story, if I gave you images and ideas, where does that lead? What does that make us think about? And the work I really want to focus on today, though, you can see from the visuals as we go through them, is a big departure for me, and possibly closest to my current preoccupation. So it's called The Long and Short of It, and it's a sound and performance installation. But even though it's a sound and performance installation, which I made in collaboration with Marcel Zeyes, who's a friend of mine, a sound artist from Switzerland based in America at the moment, the body is still central to it, because that is my background. The body is a given, but I don't obsess about what is the body dancing? Is it doing something else? It's more like the body is there, and I will deal with it. I'm not interested in saying you must do this move or you must remember these things. I'm interested in different bodies and having them create material, because you run this risk when you're from a dance background of sort of replicating things. You've been taught, if you're in Bharatnatyam, this mudra is this, and you do it over and over and over. And what you end up doing is you speak in the same vocabulary. And I'm interested in finding a new vocabulary every time. Of course, there are certain affinities that you have and you will come back to, but I don't want to fall back on my own history. And with the last two works, do you want me to stay for anything in particular, which I made with Sujay, and also The Long and Short of It, that search for a new vocabulary was very strong, although I feel it's been there even in very straight dance works. This work actually performed at G5A in February, so I don't know if some of you saw it. And this is it just before the audience walked in. So the long and short of it is basically a sound and performance installation. There are no seats. It's usually an open space, and it combines movement by contemporary dancers. They're all trained dancers. Visual design, there are lights that are movable and that they move through the show. And there's sound art, so there's an immersive soundscape. In the room, you have 2 guitar amplifiers, you have 5 microphones, you have many cables, and all of that is part of the design. And it's a 360-degree immersive setting. And so when you walk into it, it's a sensory world, and it's not like an auditorium where you're at a distance from the performance that's happening. The idea is to envelop you. And unlike in a traditional performance, this was very important to me for this work. The audience can come and go. They can move wherever they want in the performance space. The performers also move around, and the audience can exit whenever they want. That ritual of, now the performance begins and we must all sit very properly until the end. I wanted to shatter that, so did Marcel, whom I made this work with. We were trying to think of it sort of like a museum. You walk in and there are sculptures, and you sort of maybe glance over something and you walk away, you come back to it. So this work is designed such that you can leave the room if you want and come back in. It's not rude in this show, and usually when you're dealing with live performers, we're very precious about leaving, and I wanted to toy with that. So through the performance, there are 3 performers, and they repeat one 10-minute score 7 times over, so it runs for about 70 minutes. And it seems like they're repeating the same thing, but they're not. So they do a lot of performative actions, whether it's running through the space or using the microphones and guitar amplifiers to make sounds, because they're adding to the soundscape that you experience. But they change location for every loop that they perform. So you have this feeling of, I've seen this, because they just did it 10 minutes ago. But I haven't seen it because it looks slightly different, and you can't quite tell why. But that's kind of what it wants to play with, because exact repetition is impossible. It's sort of built into the score. The performers go and ask the audience members every 10 minutes, have you ever seen this before? And the truth is yes and no, maybe. Every audience member gives a different response. I've had even silent responses, like people have started acting out their response because they don't know what they want to say. But it asks this fundamental question in its form of, can there be true repetition? Yeah, this is another slide of that. The choreography itself, in its repetition, like I said, 10 minutes over and over, it's the same thing, just geographically rearranged in this space. It's trying to play with notions of displacement. So by displacement, I mean a physical relocation where you as an audience member are required to move where you're standing, and also the experience of being alienated. Displacement, to me, has a very harsh political connotation, whether we're displacing people through imaginaries or physically uprooting them. And that's built into these repetitions. So as the performers repeat the 10-minute sequence, they are constantly displacing the audience. They're running through them, saying move vocally. Sometimes it's subtler with the move of the head. And also, within the score, the performers are not allowed to remain in one place. So they're following a strict set of rules that change depending on how the audience responds. But the task for the performer is that you must follow the rule of never being in one place for too long. So it's very, very mathematically precise. And then the variable is what the audience decides to do on any given day. So what you have then is people are constantly being moved, that's the watcher, and the performers themselves are constantly being moved. And the idea is to implicate everyone so that nobody is on stable ground. And this sort of cycle of displacement goes on, and we end it at 70 minutes, but theoretically it could go on forever. The only reason we end it at 70 minutes is because, venues have to shut shop. Ideally, I would like to run this piece for 3 days and have every 2.5 hours a new set of performers coming in as a relay, just as an exercise of how far can you push the body until it withers. And that's the idea in this endless cycle. At what point does the body decay? And you see, because it's a very intimate performance, the performer could be right here, they are getting exhausted, but they're also working to a very timed score. So sometimes they slow down and then you'll see them push back. And the body's response to these very, very tight conditions was very, very important to me in this work. And it's through those very precise repetitions of patterns that I wanted to create both discomfort and intimacy, and both politics and poetry. It's a very lofty thought, but I'm just being honest of where I was. Let's see. This is how the project began. So Marcel, who's a friend of mine, and he is a composer, and he had scored music for me before. He and I decided we were not going to work like choreographer and composer, and we said, we'll just do everything. I worked with sound, he worked with body, and we started writing emails to each other because he wasn't in India at the time. And we realized that both of us were interested in time, the idea of time. So for him, time was evoked by sequences of sound. So we feel like a certain amount of time has passed when we hear certain sounds repeating, and certain sounds that feel long or certain sounds that feel short. And how do I clarify this? So his argument was that there is no such thing as a long sound or a short sound. It's all a matter of how it's arranged in relationship to each other. So one sound is not inherently short. It's short vis-a-vis something else. And he said in experiencing this in musical composition, that's how we experience the passage of time, that's how we experience rhythm, and that's how we experience what we call groove. Groove is essentially a settling into a sense of time. It's not clock-like time. It's something that's evoked by a mathematical arrangement or a sequence. And when I thought about time, I was interested in time as history and time as this historical pattern. And just like music is arranged into these sequences that are repeated, history is arranged into those sort of sequences. History doesn't actually repeat itself, but we say it repeats itself because we've arranged it into this political narrative where we're able to understand a current event in relationship to the past. So we both were approaching the idea of time from very, very different spaces. And that was the fun of this project. It was someone approaching it sonically and someone approaching it more conceptually. And we decided that we weren't going to talk about it anymore. And we said, we'll meet at the studio. So we had these email exchanges, and then we showed up with nothing really. And we showed up with this drawing, which actually came a little later. It wasn't even that we decided this. This was made on the first day. I should say that processes are dependent on time and money, and because of ours, we decided we had 1 week, one performer, one room, one guitar amplifier, and one mic and cable. And we constricted ourselves to this setting, and we started at One Shanthi Road, which is a gallery in Bangalore. in our one room, one guitar, one mic stand, you'll see the one speaker in the corner, and we set up this one table, two chairs, and we began in a blank room. And our first day was just of writing at a table. We didn't even call in our one performer. And we just sat and wrote. And we wrote about time, what both of us thought about our different articulations of time. And I work a lot with language. That doesn't mean that I have text in my work necessarily, but I am a writer, and I'm interested in the slippages between body and language. Where do the limits of language lie? Where does language fail us, and where does the body take over to encapsulate experience, and vice versa? There's a very lovely line by an American poet named Jack Gilbert, and it goes, "How astonishing it is that language can almost mean, but frightening that it does not quite." And that's an idea that plagues me. And so we started with language. Marcel also is interested in language to a certain degree. And we wrote out all the things that we were thinking of as instructions. And we made endless instructions, and we put them into a pile. And we got a performer to come in after that. And we just threw these instructions at him because we wanted to see what the body does when it's inundated with language. And these instructions were as precise as jump 10 times and then blow into the mic, to as vague as make war or make peace. And it was just a couple of hours of this poor man just listening to us literally vocalize all of these instructions that we had written. So you can see that's us going on at him. And we wanted to see, could he replicate certain ideas if we threw the same instruction at him, say, after a gap of half an hour? And after he did all of that, we chose certain actions, certain responses to these instructions that spoke to us both visually and sonically. And we began to arrange them into this kind of timeline. So first we decided just quite arbitrarily that we would choose 10 minutes. And then we divided it into every minute, and then by seconds. And then we started placing all of the actions he had done. You can see a little guitar amplifier, and the smiley face is him actually talking. That was one of his responses. And we began arranging everything like this. And while organizing the physical actions, we also began to arrange the sound score. So there are two levels of sound. I've spoken about this. One is what's in this 360 environment, and one is what the performers are making live with the instruments. And in order to make that 360-degree sound, we wanted to be contained to this room. So whatever actions he did in rehearsal, we recorded them. We recorded shaking amplifiers, scratching the walls with the mic, and we spliced this into a soundscape. So we wanted to really contain the entire work to the very, very few objects that we had given ourselves as rules. And by repeating these sounds and actions over and over a period of time, what happened was we were creating a relationship between the body and sound. And hopefully for the viewer too, just experiencing these very repetitive things, it creates a relationship. It could be a sensorial relationship, but it could also be a relationship of meaning. And that's kind of what I find quite beautiful about repetition, because we can either get bored by it, or it can be very exciting. We can get hypnotized or confused. The possibilities are really wide. But the thing is, there is always an effect in repetition. And that's really at the heart of this work. But we wanted to take this one step further. And repetition also had to, for me, get that feeling of displacement. So what we did after that was we took this score that we had made and we started directing it spatially. So there's a map that the performer follows. And regardless of whether people are in his way or not, he must follow that map. And in turn, whoever is in that path must move. And it can be quite violent, the interaction, because the performer will make sure that the person moves more or less as best as they can. And that's how we sort of transpose this idea of creating the sequence into also creating this shifting landscape. This is how the work looked when we performed it right after our 1 week of work at Shanthi Road.
This never repeats itself.
So that was the showing that we did with one performer. But what I realized after making this is that it was still very directional. I had wanted to not have the feeling of a show, but when you have just one performer, your gaze becomes very directional. So even though you're claiming to be in this immersive environment, you're still creating a very fixed frame. So then Marcel and I thought about what we really wanted to do, and we decided that we wanted to complicate the map. And we also wanted to give audiences less options to stand still, because there's only so much one performer can handle. So then we had 2 more performers come on board, and the work is now with 3 performers. And we had each of them add variations to the score that we had already created. And they don't all do the same thing at the same time. This is kind of a script they follow. So performer A, B, and C. And sometimes 2 are going fast, 1 is going slow. But their actions are precisely timed to themselves and also in relation to each other. And each of them also follows very precise maps. But to me, by having 3 performers do it, the work is much fuller. It's, I think, more complex, and it's more embodied as an experience when you watch it. Because when I watched it with these 3 people, it felt quite literally more 3-dimensional, because I couldn't look at all 3 performers at the same time. So it dismantled the stage performance a lot more for me, which was very important for this work. And even though it's a very set score that just repeats and repeats and repeats, we change it for every space. So we changed it when we performed it at G5A. Sometimes we do it across multiple rooms. And that's really interesting, because one performer could be making a sound in another room that you hear, but you don't know where the sound is coming from because you can't see them. And that sort of disparity changes the sensory experience you're having. So once we made this script and we got in more performers, the performance changed a bit. We also had a lighting design which is portable because we are poor performance people that Suja Saple designed for us. And that lighting change was interesting because the lights are in one pattern when the show begins. I mean, you might not see it if you walk in once a couple of cycles are over, you might not see the original map, but the performers start moving the lights into a straight line, but that straight line never completes itself. It goes back. So in the last loop that we show to audiences, they start setting the stage back for the beginning, as it were. I should also say that this work, because it's a loop, we don't begin it when the audience comes in. They perform it for 20 minutes to half an hour for themselves. So that audiences literally walk in the middle of the act, so they don't actually see the beginning. So this is the work from a couple of different spaces. So even though this work is, like I've said a million times by now, very precise, it never truly looks the same. It's constructed very intentionally, all of these repetitions, but it's inherently responsive to different spaces, and that's what draws me to the work, because I like sitting down with my sketchbook for every space that we're given and imagining it in every new space. And what I also like imagining is how people will respond in every space. I mean, that's not necessarily dependent on the architecture of a space, though of course it matters a lot, but it also depends on the performative context and the responses of people, whether it's to the questions that the performers ask, or if it's just to whether a performer comes close to you or not. They're very, very different. Like in G5A, we had a very feisty audience who was almost like vocally arguing with the performers, and we've had very timid audiences as well. And that's what I found most gratifying about this kind of work, which, as you can see, is very stark. It's bare. It doesn't give you much in terms of content. It's also not comfortable. I find beauty in it personally. That's an aesthetic preference, of course. But there's also a lot of discomfort, which is intentional. And yeah, there's that's what stuck with me. How people engage with this sort of bareness and this sort of precision, which is something as an artist that I love greatly. And I find that when we say that this kind of bare, stark formal, abstract, for the lack of a better word, performance work. I'm speaking very much in the realm of performance and not visual art or anything else. We'd like to say people won't get it. It's too elite, it's too niche. And performing this work, what I've realized is that that's a very condescending idea. When we're children, we go watch performances we don't understand, but we're still moved by them. It's the reason I think I'm in performance, because when I saw plays as a child, I didn't know what the stories were about, but there was something joyous about people moving on that stage. And what I have found in performing this work is that people engage with it, people stay back. Whether they get it or not is not the point, because for me, these sort of very formal works that are outside narrative are really about the things we feel. And they are spaces of sensation, and they are spaces where we can maybe confront things that we haven't confronted intellectually. And what they are most fundamentally is they're spaces beyond language. And that's what I hope to keep working with. And this is just a little poem by an American poet named Kay Ryan about the impossibility of a true repetition, which I've found very useful. And if you want to look up more about the work, that's how you contact me. And thank you.